Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for that very warm welcome. As I walked onto the lawn and saw the stoa of columns around it, I thought I'd arrived in ancient Athens. And I was silent as I came down the corridor to try to catch a sound of Socrates talking to Plato, talking to Aristotle. I thought perhaps I'd meet them, and lo, I had. And I think really this building encapsulates what I want to say to you tonight. Because in front of it, inscribed in Greek, are the words, "The truth shall make you free." And inside it, we see the legacy, the cultural and intellectual legacy of ancient Greece. So we've got Christianity and the legacy of Greece. We have Jerusalem and Athens. And it is clear to me, as I hope it is to you, that those who built this building must have felt there's a certain resonance between the two, rather than a dissonance. It is very different in our contemporary world, where many people feel that the science that partially owes its origin to the School of Athens has obliterated the possibility of believing what's stated on the outside of the building. I think that is false, and I want to tell you why. I was also delighted to discover that although your university has no official motto, there is an unofficial one, taken from a letter from Thomas Jefferson to William Roscoe, where he wrote, "This institution will be based on the illimitable freedom of the human mind. For here, we are not afraid to follow truth wherever it may lead, nor to tolerate any error, so long as reason is left free to combat it." And it's in that spirit, ladies and gentlemen, which defines your university, that I am honored to be invited to address you this evening. Now, of course, every speaker has a biography. And the danger of lectures like this is that they do not always include that dimension, that personal dimension, that shows that each of us who talk of these topics is biased. None of us start from zero. And so I wish to inform you of where I'm coming from, essentially, as we inquire about these things. From my childhood, I was fascinated by logical analysis, and you'll see a protractor over there on the floor, and I loved geometry, and particularly coming across wonderful theorems like that of Pythagoras, which were deduced, as you know, from a few postulates by logical wizardry. And one of the questions people asked was, do you need all the axioms to construct the system? And I soon came across the fascinating fact that for centuries people had tried to deduce the parallel axiom, Euclid's fifth postulate, from the others and couldn't do it. And in the 19th century, Bolyai and Lobachevsky showed that you could construct so-called non-Euclidean geometries, hyperbolic and elliptic, that did not satisfy the parallel axiom. And then the sheer delight to discover that somehow bits of the universe conformed to these pieces of abstract geometrical reasoning. Exactly what was needed they were to study space-time, whereas the earlier Euclidean geometry was very good for calculating field shapes and values and buildings. It was heady stuff for a schoolboy. And as a result, I fell in love with axiomatic systems. I don't know whether that's happened to you, ladies and gentlemen, but it did happen to me. And I confess to you that I have spent my life trying to sort out the consequences of four very simple-looking axioms that are the base from the abstract mathematical system we call the theory of groups, which has found its application in particularly the study of symmetry where it occurs, crystallography, particle physics, relativity theory, and so on. And it's in my field where some of the longest mathematical papers have been written. I never forget at Cambridge going to the lectures of the very famous American mathematician, Professor John Thomson. And he'd just done a first in the history of mathematics. He filled an entire journal with one theorem. So he came in, there were about 30 of us sitting at desks, and he put this huge volume on each of our desks. I still have it today. And he looked at us and started his lectures with the immortal words, "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "the first 100 results here are pretty trivial, so I've started 101. The class of 2 people in it the following day. The longest theorem in the history of mathematics is also in my subject. The classification of finite simple groups that takes 10,000 journal pages, and there are only 1 or 2 people in the world, not including me, I confess straight away, who understand it. But mathematics is one thing. Science, on which so much of mathematics is used, raises similar questions. Does it have axioms in any sense? Does it involve beliefs? Are there fundamental postulates that lie at its heart? Because scientists appear to be interested in finding out truth about the universe out there. And I found that most scientists believe that there is truth, that they were getting nearer and nearer to, although they would never claim to have entirely reached it. They were, as we would say today, critical realists. I did meet some people, and I still do, who tell me that they do not believe there is any such thing as absolute truth, except they expect me to take their statement as absolute truth. And so they don't carry a great deal of ultimate conviction. One does notice that these postmodern statements usually accept the person making the statement, and so their validity is not only questionable, they become logically incoherent. I notice that very few of my scientific colleagues take this relativist view, at least in their science. They may do it in other areas of life. And what about the reality that science claims to study? Were there axioms here? Were there fundamental postulates about what constituted ultimate reality? And very soon I stumbled across this. That going back to the ancient Greeks, you have 2, essentially, and that'll have to do for tonight, 2 major worldviews. There were the brilliant atomists like Democritus and Leucippus, who thought of the idea of the atom, atomos, something that cannot be cut. And their idea was that reality ultimately consists of 2 things, the atoms and the void. And the atoms cascade through the void, and of themselves they form the universe, life, and everything else. Because there is nothing else. They are, of course, materialists. But there were others in the same school, like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, that said, no, there's something more. There is this fascinating material universe, but there is transcendence. There's something beyond. There are the gods, or there is God. And so, barreling up through history, right into the contemporary academy, you've got these 2 worldviews, which I will call tonight materialism or theism. And then it occurred to me that I began to wonder, could it be that these worldviews have an influence on what people understand science to be? Or is science completely objective and worldview free? And what about my own worldview? I come from Northern Ireland, which is a tiny country a long way away. My parents were Christian, but remarkably for those days they were not sectarian. Because as you know, Northern Ireland hasn't always the best reputation for advertising the truth and peacefulness of the Christian faith. So I grew up there, and I know all about sectarian violence. But my parents were very remarkable people. They were Christian without being sectarian, and they were bombed because of it. Secondly, they allowed me to think. They gave me the greatest gift that parents can give to their children. They allowed me to read widely. So long before I come to university, I read as widely as C.S. Lewis to Marx, Dostoevsky, North Whitehead, and the rest of it. They were not educated people, but they loved learning. And they felt that this was the thing that was totally compatible with their Christianity, to explore the riches of the universe. I'm so thankful to them. And then I arrived in Cambridge, and the most important thing happened on day one, where I saw the girl who became my wife. But I'm not going to discuss that anymore. The second, probably most important thing happened shortly into the first week. When I was sitting at dinner in my college, Emmanuel College, and a student said to me, "Do you believe in God?" And I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot you're Irish." All you Irish believe in God, and you fight about it. Now, of course, I'd heard that many times, but I thought, now I've got a real chance. I'm in one of the best universities in the world. There are many atheists, agnostics, people of other faiths, and so on. I'm going to get to know these people. Not just get to know what they believe, but get to know them as real friends and explore with them, because it could be, you see. It could be that what I believe is a product of Irish genetics. And I was interested in whether or not it was true. So that started me on a life's journey that's taken me to many parts of the world. I've always had an interest in languages. I wanted to be a linguist, but they persuaded me to do mathematics. But I kept interested in languages and went to Germany as a von Humboldt fellow. I mean, after all, languages are compressing ideas into symbols, and mathematics is the extreme version of it. So you find many of us who are mathematicians are fascinated by natural languages. So I learned to speak German, and that started taking me into, in the Cold War days, into Eastern Europe. And in East Germany, where I spoke the language fluently, I could interact with people, and I became very interested in studying the lives and the thinking of people who've been systematically exposed to atheism in their school system. An atheistic state, where people of 13 had to swear public allegiance to the atheistic state or they got no more education. So I saw atheism in action. And then I had been for a lot of my academic life a translator of mathematical Russian. And so when the wall fell, and I helped to knock it down, gently, but I did help, and I got a piece of it at home. I started to go to Russia, particularly Siberia, and that was absolutely fascinating. And since 1989 until essentially now, I've regularly visited Russia and more laterally Ukraine, discussing in the academies of science and in the universities these issues. And you know, when I first turned up in Siberia on a two-way ticket, mind you, when I first turned up there, I discovered instantly that I was a complete enigma, because they had never met anybody like me, an academic who believed in God. That was a total puzzle. And it was such a puzzle for them that they would ask me questions in mathematics seminars. I mean, can you imagine that happening here? You give a lecture in algebra, and they nod pleasantly and ask you questions, and then say, "We got other questions we want to ask you." Like what? "Well, we hear you believe in God. Why?" And in an academic seminar, you have an hour's questions about God. That happened again and again and again. And because I could lecture in Russian, every door was open to me in Russia, in the universities. It was a fascinating time. Getting to know people who find it very difficult to even conceptualize the ideas I was talking about. They were totally new to them. So that's the kind of background I've had. And that interest in God, I asked them, why is this enormous interest? Well, they said, Dostoevsky, for us, is a bit of a prophet, you know, because he once wrote, Jeśli Bóg nie pozwolił, which, as you all know, means, if God does not exist, everything is permissible. Now, he did not mean that atheists couldn't be moral. Of course they can, and sometimes I'm put to shame by my atheist friends. What he meant was, there is no rational base for morality if there is no God. And what they would say to me is, look at our country. We thought we could retain a value for human beings and reject God. We discovered we couldn't. And millions of us have died to pay for that mistake. So I've met in my life brilliant scientists who are atheists. Absolutely brilliant. At the very top of world science, including several Nobel Prize winners. I've met brilliant scientists who are believers in God, including Nobel Prize winners. Now, that shows me, ladies and gentlemen, that the question that we're facing tonight, has science buried God, hasn't got a simplistic answer. Because if it had, all scientists would be atheists and no scientist would be a theist or a Christian. And the very fact that people at the top level of science, Jim Watson, an atheist, Nobel Prize winner, co-discoverer of the double helix structure of DNA, Bill Phillips, Nobel Prize winner in physics in the USA as well, a Christian. The very fact that such people exist shows us that we need to look elsewhere. The conflict I want to suggest to you tonight is very real, but it is not between science and theism. The conflict is between the two worldviews I've just mentioned. Between materialism or naturalism, there's a slight difference, but they commonly do not believe in anything supernatural. Between naturalism and theism, that's the conflict, and there are scientists on both sides of it. Now, if we grasp that, I think we're in a position to enter the real question and pose it. The real question, as I see it, is this. Granted that there's the big worldview of naturalism and the big worldview of theism, and imagine science as a circle in the middle. The big question is, which way does science point? Richard Dawkins, with whom I've debated, as you have heard, believes, of course, that science points straight to atheism, and you cannot be intellectually respectable unless you're an atheist. I take the exact opposite view, that science points towards theism. And that, of course, makes for a debate, which I think is very important in our public space. Now, why do I think that science has not buried God? Well, firstly, a little bit of history. I was invited to give the very first lecture on these topics in Akademgorodok in Novosibirsk University, the elite university where Yeltsin got many of his leaders. And the rector, thinking I was an innocent mathematician, of course he was right, he decided that since I wasn't a priest I couldn't be dangerous, and so he allowed me to give a lecture on why a scientist believes in a creator. It was a fascinating experience, and one of the things I started telling them, without thinking very much about it, I said, well, ladies and gentlemen, one of the very interesting things is that in the 16th and 17th centuries, modern science exploded in Western Europe, and people ask the question, why did it happen then and why did it happen there? And the generally accepted theory, with nuances of course, is that it had to do with the Christian background. And as I mentioned that, and went on to say that Galileo was a believer in God, so was Kepler, so was Newton, so was John Maxwell, so was Babbage, so was... I saw anger rising in the front row of the heavyweight professors, and I got slightly nervous at this. So I stopped and I said, what's wrong with you? And one of them stood up and said, why were we never told? I said, what do you mean, why were you never told? He said, this is the first time any of us here, and I speak for all of us, have ever heard that any of these people believed in God. Why were we never told? So I said, can't you guess? Fascinating, isn't it? It's something that's easily forgotten. The best formulation of this was given by C.S. Lewis, who said, men became scientific because they expected law of nature, and they expected law of nature because they believed in the lawgiver. And this is my first major point, ladies and gentlemen. Why should I be ashamed of being a scientist and a Christian when Christianity gave me my subject? That's my first major point. There is no intrinsic conflict between belief in God and science, but there is a deep-seated concord. Belief in God was the motor that drove science. So why then is there a widespread conviction that science has buried God? Because of a whole series of confusions, not only about science, but about God. And I want to talk about these briefly. For instance, when I was in Siberia on another occasion, when most of the front row, this sort of part here, was occupied by the KGB, which is quite a frightening sight, you know, when you've got about 30 KGB colonels sitting in front of you. And I was talking about these things, and one of them lost his temper, and he got up, and there was a big blackboard, and he came, and he drew as best he could a lightning flash on it. And he said, what this man, that is me, is saying is dangerous. It's really dangerous, because you see, this lightning here, do you know, they used to believe that was the voice of the gods. And now, of course, we've done a bit of science. We know it's atmospheric physics, discharge, pressure, electricity, static, all the rest of it. Exit God. So he clearly felt very strongly about that. And when I was eventually allowed to reply, I said, one thing we can agree on right away is that the God you don't believe in, I don't believe in either. I said, I suppose on the same argument that you've just used, you would stop believing in Henry Ford once you discovered how a Ford motor engine worked. You see, when Newton discovered his law of gravitation, he didn't say, now I know how it works, therefore I don't need God. No, he wrote the most brilliant book in the history of science called the Principia Mathematica, and expressed in it the hope that it would persuade the thinking man to believe in God. Because you see, God for him was not a God of the gaps. That is, I can't explain it, therefore God did it. Because if you believe in a God of the gaps, then the more science, the less God. The more God, the less science. And that lies behind Dawkins, Hawking, Hitchens, Singer, and all of them who offer us today a choice between God or science. And I said to Richard Dawkins once, don't you think that's a bit dangerous, even in principle? Some people might just prefer God, so that you would be guilty of putting them off science. I'm passionate about science, and it's very important we realize what is wrong with this. Firstly, God is not a God of the gaps. He's the God that created the whole show. So the more Newton understood about how it works, the more he could admire the genius of the God who did it that way. Just as the more I understand about painting, the more I can appreciate the genius of Raphael, who painted that painting that way. If I don't know much about it, I not see what a work of genius that is. We're all aware of this. So instead of believing in a God of the gaps, ladies and gentlemen, the more I know of science, the more I'm led to admire the genius of the Creator who did it that way. Now, there's a second confusion lying in this, and that is a confusion about explanation. You see, Hawking and Dawkins offer us God or science or God or gravity. That is what I call offering people false alternatives, because they are explanations, but they're not the same kind of explanation. Let me illustrate that simply. Suppose we had a Ford Galaxy automobile here, and I said I've got two sets of explanations for this. One is mechanical engineering and the law of internal combustion. The other is Henry Ford. Will you please choose between them? Well, you say, don't be silly. That's exactly the choice you're being asked from Dawkins. You would say, in order to understand this automobile completely, you have to have both an explanation in terms of mechanism and law on the one side, and an explanation in terms of agency, Henry Ford, on the other. And those explanations, far from contradicting, they complement each other to give you a multi-level explanation. And it is utterly absurd to argue, as these scientists do, that if you can give an explanation in terms of mechanism at the scientific level or law, that automatically, per se, excludes an agent. That is simply to make what philosophers regard as a very elementary and trivial category mistake. Now, in that connection, there are two further popular objections to the existence of God that relate to the nature of explanation. And because Richard Dawkins has made them the heart of his book, The God Delusion, I thought I'd mention them even before they would come up in questions so that you can ask me other questions. That is, if you think I've answered them. Firstly, God, if you regard him as an explanation at all, is by definition more complicated than the thing you're explaining, so God is no explanation. Well, that sounds very impressive. So what I said to Richard Dawkins was, I pick up a book called The God Delusion. It's 450 pages. It's quite complex. So I asked for an explanation of it. And then I discovered it originates in the infinitely more complex mind of Richard Dawkins. So I instantly reject that explanation, because of course the mind of Richard Dawkins is more complex than the book I'm trying to explain, so that's no explanation at all. Well, even you can see that silly, can't you? And yet that is the level of the logic. You see, we've been bamboozled into thinking, and there are reasons for it, of course, that explanation per se must always be. It must always run from the simple upwards to the complex. But that's not actually true. It's good when we can reduce something into simpler parts, but we can't always do that. And when we come across something that has got not simply a material dimension to it, but a semiotic dimension, that is, it involves symbols that carry meaning, we always, without exception, infer upwards to a mind that is more complex than the thing we're studying. So it seems to me that doesn't work. Now, related to it is the much more famous objection that I've met already several times this week, in Harvard as well, from professors, interestingly. And that was, if you believe in God as creator, well then logically you will have to ask who created the creator. And then you have to ask who created the creator that created the creator that created the creator, and so on and so on and so on. And the thing is absurd, it's an infinite regress, so why don't we just pack up, forget about God and go home? Well, it sounds marvellous, but it's not too late for logic, ladies and gentlemen. Let's try and logically analyse the question. Because there's a name for it. It's called the complex question. Because what that question, who created the creator, does is to shut down the number of possible answers to make them look ridiculous, while at the same time bypassing answers that make sense. And let me try to tell you what that means. If I ask the question, who created X? What am I assuming in asking the question? I'm assuming, of course, that X was created. If you say, who created X? You're assuming X was created. But what if X wasn't created? Well, then the question doesn't apply to X, of course. And if Richard Dawkins had written a book called The Created God's Delusion, I don't think anybody would have bought it. I certainly wouldn't. Because for centuries we've known that created gods are a delusion. We usually call them idols. Yes. So you see, it actually sounds clever, but it isn't clever. I used to hear it a lot in Russia. I was very surprised to find it at the heart of a book by Richard Dawkins, but there we are. The biblical claim held by the three great monotheistic religions Judaism, Christianity, and Islam is that God was not created. He always existed. And so that question doesn't apply to him. Now I could go on about that, but it's perhaps more interesting to reverse the thing. Because I pointed out to Richard Dawkins that this question is a sting, you see. He regarded it as a legitimate question about the God I believe in. It's not, because the God I believe in is eternal, he's uncreated. But then I thought I would apply it to him. And I said, Richard, you believe that the universe created you. So the universe is your creator. So I said, let me ask you your own question. Who created your creator? Still waiting for the answer. You see, ladies and gentlemen, no matter on which side we are, we come to an ultimate reality very quickly. On the side of the materialist or naturalist, the ultimate reality is the universe and the multiverse. On the Christian side, the ultimate reality is God. And the question is not, is there an ultimate reality? Both sides believe in ultimate realities. The question is, which reality is really ultimate? And that we have to decide, of course, on the basis of evidence. So, the next confusion that leads to many people thinking science has buried God is the view we call scientism. That is, science explains everything. I was just reading Alex Rosenberg's book, The Atheist Guide to Reality, just come out, and he says there's much more to atheism than its knockdown arguments that there's no God. He says the mistake is to think that there's any more to reality than the laws of nature that science discovers. That's scientism. Science is the only way to truth. Or as Bertrand Russell put it, what science cannot tell us, mankind cannot know. But you see, ladies and gentlemen, both of those statements, science is the only way to truth, and what science cannot tell us, mankind cannot know, neither of them is a statement of science, so you cannot know them. If they're true, they're false. It's too late for that kind of logic, obviously, isn't it? These are logically incoherent statements. They go too far. They are not statements of science. They're statements actually about science. So you have to go elsewhere, and much wiser was Sir Peter Medawar, a Nobel Prize winner, who said it's so easy to see the limits of science. Science cannot answer the simple questions of a child. Where do I come from? Where am I going? What's the meaning of my life? And that's right. Einstein said once, you can speak of the ethical foundations of science, but you cannot talk about the scientific foundations of ethics. Because, ladies and gentlemen, if it were true that science is the only way to truth, you'd have to close down at least half, or more than half, of the School of Athens and the same in this university. I think some of you do history, don't you, and economics. These are not sciences in the strict sense of the word, but they are vastly important, highly rational activities. And what is happening in the world today is there is pressure for the public to think that, firstly, science is the only way to truth, and alongside that, science extends and defines rationality. That's nonsense. Science is not coextensive with rationality. And it's very important for us to realize it. So that's another confusion that fuels the flames. And the next one is a confusion about the nature of faith. I had a debate with Peter Singer, the Princeton bioethicist in his home country of Australia recently. And I told him, just by way of introduction, background, a little bit about my home in Ireland and so on. And as he started to speak, of course, he said, I must be honest and tell you that the biggest reason against belief in God, to my mind, is this, that people remain in the faith in which they were brought up. And he didn't quite say like me, but I said it for him, like me, you see. So I said, Peter, let's balance the thing a little bit. Let me ask you a question. What about your parents? Were they atheists? Yes, he said, they were atheists. So he said, you've remained in the faith in which you were brought up then. Oh, but he said it isn't a faith. I said, sorry, I was under the impression you believed it. Now that little interchange is so revealing about the state of thinking about these issues. The notion that the atheistic worldview is not a belief system, but that religious faith is a belief system, is simply false. And yet, they believe it. I mean, it is astonishing what they write about it. Richard Dawkins says faith is one of the world's great evils, comparable to the smallpox virus, but harder to eradicate. And we laugh at that, but ladies and gentlemen, that is a very serious statement. What do you mean, eradicate faith? And the new atheists would like to do that, eradicate religious faith. Dawkins says so. Not all atheists, and I know there'll be atheists here tonight, and I want to say, many of my atheist friends, and I have many in Oxford, come to me and say, don't associate us with that. Because we do not believe that. Jürgen Habermas, one of the continent's leading atheists, and I read his works with great interest, says we need to be very careful with these attacks against religion, because if we cut off religion, we are cutting off a very important source for creating meaning. Not only that, he adds this, look at our legal system, look at our educational system, look at our hospitals, hospices, our human rights legislation. It all comes from the Judeo-Christian tradition. And he adds, as an atheist, something astonishing. We have no other source, he says. Everything else is just postmodern chatter. That's not me. That's one of the leading thinkers on the continent. So don't go away with the idea that I think all atheist thinking is like Dawkins. It is not. There are many people who respect me. They disagree with me. They think that what I believe isn't true, and I respect them. And I think what they believe isn't true, but we can have a reasoned public discussion. So the situation is that this faith notion has become a major problem, because the new atheists have spread about the idea, two false ideas. One, that faith is believing where there's no evidence. Now that's nonsense. That is what most of us call blind faith. And I asked Richard Dawkins that in one of our debates, I said, have you any evidence for trusting your wife? And he started off saying, of course, the husband notices this and that, the other thing and so on. So I said, so you do believe in evidence-based faith? Oh, but he said it isn't faith, but it was too late. We all know, ladies and gentlemen, what evidence-based faith is. We all know the disappointment of trusting someone on the basis of what we thought was evidence and they let us down. All of us in the world, alas, knows that it was possibly a mistake to trust certain bankers because the evidence base wasn't there. It froze up the financial system. Why? Because people couldn't get the trust back. I don't meet anybody that doesn't understand that the proper use of the word faith, coming from the Latin fides, means trust and loyalty. And in every instance where we use it, the legitimate question is, where is your evidence and what do you base your trust on? Now, I cannot, of course, speak for other religions. They have the right and should speak for themselves. But I can say this. The Christian faith claims to be based on evidence. Now, in every religion and in no religion, there are, of course, people who blindly believe, and they can be very dangerous people. But as far as Christianity's teaching goes, the answer to the question is clear. At the end of the Gospel of John, he writes, these things are written, many other things Jesus did in the presence of his disciples which are not written in this book, but these are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life in his name. In other words, here's the evidence. I've chosen these things, and you can base a trust in them that Jesus is this and that, and also you can base a personal experience on those things. You see, if Christianity was believing where there's no evidence, you'd have to scrap the Bible, because the Bible claims to be evidence. It's very simple to see. But now, there's another very big problem, and that is this, that holding the view as they do that faith is believing where there is no evidence, they don't realize that science involves faith at its heart. And here it gets extremely interesting, because in order to do science, you have to believe, as Einstein saw, that the universe is at least accessible in part to the human mind. In other words, it's rationally, mathematically intelligible. And a Nobel Prize winner of physics, Eugene Wigner, wrote a very famous paper saying that on the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. I mean, here's a mathematician, she's thinking in here, she thinks up some equations, and they apply to the universe out there. How does that work? He said this is unreasonably effective. It was the same thing that led Einstein to say the only incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. You see, they were clever enough to see there's a problem. How is it that we can do science? Now, Einstein says he couldn't imagine a scientist without that faith. Notice the word. And my teacher of quantum physics at Cambridge, Professor Sir John Polkinghorne, points out endlessly, physics is powerless to explain its faith in the mathematical intelligibility of the universe for the simple reason that you cannot begin to do physics without believing in that intelligibility. Now here's a very interesting thing. Why should I, as a scientist, believe that science can be done? And here I bring in Charles Darwin, who wrote a very interesting thing. With me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of the monkey's mind, if there are any convictions in such a mind? Now, in recent years, philosophers have noticed this. Because of advances in understanding some of the processes are involved, and the fascination on the part of the neuroscientists in our faculties of cognition. And many of them tell me that our human cognitive faculties were produced by natural processes that were not concerned with truth at all, but with survival. Well, my first thought is that we all know what has generally happened, and still does happen, to truth, when individuals or commercial enterprises or nations motivated by their selfish genes feel themselves threatened and struggle for survival. But to return to the philosophical level, the natural position is that thought is some kind of neurophysiological phenomenon. And from the evolutionary perspective, that might well be adaptive. But why would one think for a moment that the beliefs caused by that neurophysiology should be mostly true? Chemist J.B.S. Haldane pointed out long ago, if the thoughts in my mind are just the motions of atoms in my brain, a mechanism that has arisen by mindless, unguided processes, why should I believe anything it tells me, including the fact it's made of atoms? I put it to you, if you go to your computer tomorrow, and you know that it has been produced by mindless, unguided processes, how much would you trust it? Now, the interesting thing here is that we're dealing with something utterly fascinating. And one of America's leading philosophers, Alvin Plantinga, has put it this way. If Dawkins is right, that we are the product of mindless, unguided natural processes, then he has given us strong reason to doubt the reliability of human cognitive faculties, and therefore inevitably to doubt the validity of any belief that they produce, including Dawkins' own science and its atheism. Now listen to this very carefully. His biology and his belief in naturalism would therefore appear to be at war with each other in a conflict that has nothing at all to do with God. In other words, and this is my chief objection to the atheistic worldview, is not that it's anti-God, of course it is that by definition, but that it undermines the foundations of the very rationality I need to construct any argument at all, including scientific arguments I use in my own discipline. I bring in somebody rather surprising at this point, and that's Friedrich Nietzsche. He said this: only assume a God who is morally or like? Can truth and the search for truth be at all something meaningful and promising of success? This God left aside, the question is permitted whether being deceived is not one of the conditions of life. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, I'm suggesting to you that far from science having buried God, naturalism, taking to its logical conclusion, buries science. That is the extreme reverse proposition, isn't it? Now, what I'm suggesting is that taken to its logical conclusion, a materialistic view of the brain and the mind demolishes argument completely. Now, how does Christian theism, the other worldview, fare? Well, of course it fares very well, because it suggests to us that the reason that the mind in here can partly understand the universe out there is that because both are traceable back to the same intelligent God. So, to sum my argument up, I'm saying that although there appears to many people to be a conflict between science and belief in God, this is very superficial, and in fact there's a deep-seated concord. On the other hand, although it would appear to many people that there's a deep-seated concord between science and naturalism, in fact, there's a deep-seated and irreconcilable conflict. You see, ironically, it is science that's beginning to show that naturalism is doomed. Because it teaches that the universe is a causally closed system. Any causes of what happens in the universe are within the system according to naturalism, and there can be no causal influence from outside since there is no outside. This means, by definition, that everything must be explained reductionistically in terms of physical and chemical processes. But the naturalists who insist on explaining everything in terms of such processes cannot explain their own scientific theories or mathematical equations in terms of mere physical processes. For this very simple reason, that theories, laws, and equations are not physical. They are non-physical. Indeed, we've lived to a fascinating stage of physics, where we have discovered information. And there is a huge discussion about the nature of information. And there's a consensus growing, is my impression, that information is not reducible to physics and chemistry. It is, of course, immaterial. Now here's the irony. That generations of people, assuming a materialistic philosophy, have thrown up something that isn't material, and it lies at the heart of science. I find extremely interesting. Extremely interesting. And, you know, why don't I tell you a little story? Shall I tell you a story? It's story time, isn't it? In my college at Oxford, we've got these lovely dinners. I'd love to be able to invite you all, but we haven't enough space for them. So there's usually a seating plan, and one night I found myself to be seated beside a world-famous biochemist. And he asked me what I did in the Oxford style, and I said I'm a pure mathematician. He said, how very boring. So I said, oh, well, I'm interested in bigger questions than that. He said, like what? Like the status of the universe and so on. Oh, he said, it's worse than that. Listen, I'm an atheist, I'm a reductionist, we've nothing to talk about, we're going to have an utterly miserable evening. And he meant it. So I said, you know, we're going to have a great evening. He said, how's that? And I said, reductionism, I'm fascinated by it. I know at least 3 kinds, what kind do you? And he wasn't quite sure of the 3 kinds, so I helped him out being kind of. And I said, you're probably a methodological reductionist. You take a big problem, split it into little problems, solve the little problems inside of the big problem. Yes, he said, I do that in the lab. But I said, really what we're talking about is ontological reductionism. Everything reducible to physics and chemistry. He said, that's what I believe. I said, okay, let's do an experiment. He said, what, here at the dinner table? I said, sure, why not? So I picked up the menu and asked him to read it. Roast chicken. It wasn't even in French, so it was boring. And he said, what's special about that? And I said, have a look at this. R-O-A-S-T. Those are signs that carry meaning when they're assembled in that order. He said, that's right. And you're a reductionist, everything reduced to physics and chemistry. So I said, have a go at that. Explain to me the semiotics of those words in terms of the physics and chemistry of the paper. His wife was beside him, and rather too loudly she said, get out of that if you can. He didn't try. He said something that I shall never forget. Stunning in its honesty. He said, you know, John, he was now friendly, you know, John, for 40 years I've gone into my laboratory thinking it can't. I said, half a minute. I started to play devil advocate. I said, science has only been going for 500 or 600 years. He said, it doesn't matter. When I look at that, I infer immediately upwards to an intelligence, because it's not within the capacity of physics and chemistry. It doesn't have the explanatory power to deal with an informational input from outside. And then he paused and he looked at me, and just it dawned on him that I wasn't clever enough to have thought of the argument. He said, where did you get that argument? I said, from the Nobel Prize winner. Oh, he said, that's okay. But you see, ladies and gentlemen, that brings me to this. We're faced with two worldviews. One says in the beginning were the particles or mass energy, the void in the atoms, and of themselves, with the laws of nature wherever they came from. This is another question, of course. They produce life, mind, and the idea of God, because there's no God. That's one worldview. The other worldview is this. In the beginning was the Word. All things came to be through him. Without him, nothing came to be that came to be. You see the difference between the two? The first one makes mass energy primary and mind derivative. The second makes mind, the mind of God, primary and mass energy derivative. And it's not simply as a Christian, but as a scientist, that I tell you, I infinitely prefer the Word to the particles. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. That is remiss of me, but I did promise to stop within 50 minutes. He started by talking about one of the things that causes immense difficulty among my scientific colleagues, and that is the question of miracles, and in particular the resurrection of Jesus. And I just mention it that I'm aware he raised it, and so if any of you want to raise it, feel quite happy to do so. Of course, if you don't, I won't say anything about it. So I'll collect a few, so put up your hand and the mic will get to you. And then just start talking. Now remember, the time you take to formulate your question is time taken away from somebody else. And we want to do as many as we can to see what people's thoughts are. So thank you. And let's get over here.
Thank you for delivering this lecture. Has science buried God? And I haven't still understood what kind of science you're talking about. Is it the inductive science? Is it the falsification science, Popper, or is it the paradigm science of Kuhn? Because wherever you're starting, you would find a different result. And then what kind of God you're talking about? Is it the God, the pantheistic God, the theistic God, or the Christian God? And within now, would the God you're proving lead to a Catholic God or to a Protestant God? It's a pretty important question.
Okay.
And where are you leading that? Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Next question.
Number 2.
Where's the microphone?
There's one down here, there's one back there.
Let's take right here.
Professor, thank you very much for coming. I'm wondering, as an intellectual, how do you reconcile belief in an omnipotent, benevolent God with the problem of evil, the existence of moral evil, and physical evil in our universe? Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, next question.
Well, I thought my question might be off topic, but considering that question, I think I'll go ahead and ask it, and if you think it's off topic, that's okay, but I'd be very grateful for any thoughts you have. And I'm asking this since I don't really have any problem with a mind being behind the word of the universe, so I'm kind of going away from the science for a moment to more of theodicy and theology. I wrote it down to be more efficient with my words. So, in order to place no culpability on God for the entrance of evil into the world through the rebellion of the first humans, Dr. Ravi Zacharias, C.S. Lewis, and many others explain evil as the abuse of man's free will and say that man's love of God could not have been free if he did not have the option to sin or to reject God and choose himself. In other words, we could not freely love God unless we had an alternative choice of rejecting him or sinning. However, every theologian I have read, and I think Scripture as well, supports the assertion that in heaven, in our eternal future, it will be impossible to sin, even in our thoughts, and yet we will love God freely there.
Okay.
How can it be both ways?
Can I just say, ladies and gentlemen, it was a very interesting question, but if we can try to keep the questions on topic, I cannot answer all questions from Genesis to Revelation anyway, and I certainly can't do it tonight. But we'll try to do our best with these. Okay, next one.
Do you put a lot of emphasis on symbolic information being encoded in symbols, and that this automatically points to a mind? So wherever you see, as you say, wherever you see a sign, you see a creator, an intelligence behind that sign. And I would say the primary counterexample is clearly DNA, because DNA carries information. We talk about it that way. It's symbolic, and yet we know, quite interestingly, how this purely unintelligent process of natural selection gives rise to an intelligent system of symbols which encodes information. So I'm just curious what you think about that.
Thank you, John. Next question.
Is it ever appropriate for anyone, professors and teachers included, to speak of scientific theory as truth?
Okay, let's take one more before John answers these questions. Do I get to go? Okay.
I thought you were going to let me go on and on answering them, and then I wouldn't have to answer any of them if I just keep writing it down. Okay, one more.
So you said that we should be striving for an evidence-based faith. So what are some sources of evidence other than the Bible or personal spiritual experience? And how do these sources of evidence point to the Christian God as opposed to other gods?
Okay, is that it, Mr. Chairman? How long have we got? Because these are very interesting and important questions. So let's have a look at them. Well, I'll answer them in some sort of order, which won't be the order in which they came. Let me look at the question, is scientific theory true? Now, if you go to Philosophy 101, something like that, you will learn about various theories of truth. The coherence theory of truth. Does it cohere? Does it make sense? The correspondence theory of truth. Does it correspond to reality? And so on. And I think my impression is that most scientists would say that there is truth out there to which their researchers are approximating, but they never reach it in any absolute sense. Science is always, one would hope, open to question, open to modification, and you don't have to look back very far to realize that some of the fundamental paradigms of science have been totally overthrown, and sometimes in a very short time. For instance, plate tectonics is probably one of the most spectacular examples of a complete reversal of theories of the relationship of the Earth's surface to its core that we've seen. So I think most scientists would want to be humble about it. I sometimes put it this way to myself, you know, scientists ought to be very humble because they study a given with a given. You notice that no scientist put the universe there. It was already there. And no scientist invented the human brain. So we study a given with a given. And that ought to keep us humble. So that question of, no, we're not claiming absolute truth. Now, there is an exception to that the mathematicians would want to be concerned about, because, and it relates to the word proof which comes in here. People often say to me, can you prove it to me? And I say, well, there are two meanings of the word proof at least. One is in pure mathematics only, where you can give, in a sense, an absolute proof. Granted these axioms, granted these rules of logic, the conclusion is secure. But you don't get that in any of the natural sciences, which I'm saying in another way. But what you can say is, look, the evidence so far points towards this. So I'm not claiming tonight, in the wider context of this, to prove God in that mathematical sense. You cannot do that. What I'm claiming to do is to give pointers, evidence that we can consider and we can estimate, just as we listen to our atheist friends producing evidence, and we can sift that, and we have to in the end come to our own conclusions. So that's a bit about science and truth. Now, the first question asked me, I think, 4 questions, which is a very clever thing to do, of course, and saying, what kind of science are we talking about? Well, this is a general lecture to a general audience. And I think, in light of the kind of examples I mentioned, that most people would be roughly familiar with what we're talking about. But the questioner has a very important point. Because, of course, science is almost impossible to define. And if you read one of the, I think, very good books, What is This Thing Called Science?, you realize that it's like time. Augustine once said, all of us know what time is until we try to define it. And it has been difficult to define it. And so now people are more cautious. And they say, well, there are certain things that we associate with doing science. Now, you mentioned induction. And the idea of that is, of course, that if we've made an observation 100 times and it gives us the same result, we expect that to happen the 101st time. But there are difficulties with that. Bertrand Russell told the famous story of the inductivist turkey, who was fed on 364 days of the year, and inductively expected to be fed on the 365th. But the 365th day was Thanksgiving. You mentioned paradigms, which I mentioned, and Thomas Kuhn, and so on. What I'm talking about in my talk, I hope I made it clear, sorry about that, is what people generally understand to be science. That is, they're listening to Dawkins say, we've got these laws, we've got these descriptions, there's no room for God. Or Stephen Hawking in his book, we've got a law of gravity, so we don't need God. And what I've been trying to show to you tonight, that these arguments don't hold water at all. Then you say, what kind of God? Is he a pantheistic God, or a Christian God, or a Catholic God, or a Protestant God? That is a different question, and it's related to the very last question I was asked. So I'm going to leave it, all right? So we'll come back to this next one. Now, I was intrigued by your question on DNA. I've heard DNA stated as a primary counterexample to what I have been saying. And let me explain what I mean by that. The interesting thing is, and I sometimes drop this in an Oxford common room when life is getting boring, and I use the roast chicken analogy, you see, and people say it's a mind. And then I say, you go into your laboratory where there's a magic stereoscopic microscope, and as you look in that microscope, you watch a double helix unraveling, and you see it spitting off letters C, G, A, A, T, T, G, G, C, C, T, A, G, and so on. And you can see it's a magic microscope, because we haven't a microscope that will do that. And you look at these 3.5 or so billion letters in exactly the right order, functioning as a computer program, and you ask, what's the origin of that? And without hesitation, many of my colleagues say chance and necessity. I say, what? You look at the 5 letters on the menu, and you infer mind. How is it you look at 3.5 billion letters, and you don't bring mind into play, whatever mechanisms may have been involved? Why do you do that? I'm still waiting for an answer, ladies and gentlemen. The questioner mentioned natural selection. But you see, the origin of life is the prelude to evolution. Evolution doesn't explain the origin of life. For years, Richard Dawkins was trumpeting this. And in his Blind Watchmaker, he said that this process that Darwin discovered is the explanation for the existence and form of all of life. But it isn't. And I was glad to see that in his recent book, The Greatest Show on Earth, he has put it in black and white, it isn't. Evolutionary processes do not explain the origin of life, because evolution depends on the existence of a mutating replicator. Now, this is a huge question in which I am deeply interested. Why it is blindly said that chance and the laws of nature will produce something that has meaning. But what I'm very pleased to hear, the way you formulated your question, is that you believe that DNA is that kind of thing. That it is actually something that codes for something else. It's got a semiotic dimension. And I don't want to give a lecture on it, but I'm going to do a shameless bit of advertising, ladies and gentlemen. I'm so interested in this, I've written a book about it. And it's the book that's with the title of this lecture, God's Undertaker, Science Buried Law. Because I think there's a great deal to be said about your particular question. So thank you very much for asking it. The thing I would disagree with you is that we know how purely unintelligent processes have produced it. That is the thing we do not know. And every origin of life researcher I talk to, and I've talked to many, says exactly the same thing. We do not have a notion. In fact, we're further away from it than we were in 1953 when they did the experiment, Miller and Urey, that won them the Nobel Prize, passing an electrical discharge through a so-called prebiotic suit. We're much further back, because in those days it was not realized the sophisticated nature of DNA. And ladies and gentlemen, I go to, I'm a mathematician interested in these things, so I go to a seminar on systems biology in Oxford. And it's very interesting to listen to Dennis Noble, who's the founder of systems biology and has written a fascinating little book called The Music of Life. And he talks about the genes being like an organ. And the organ is being played. The sophistication of the complexity is multiple. So I'm fascinated by what's going on. So this is something worth pursuing, but we can't pursue it anymore tonight. Now, there were 2 questions of the problem of evil. Now, the problem of evil is, in a sense, a step beyond this lecture, very clearly. What I've simply been arguing from the intellectual side, or trying to, that science has not buried God, the idea that there's an intelligent God behind the universe. This question, which is the hardest question I face, of course, by definition, this question is about the nature of God, if there is a God. But of course, it is used as well as science to argue the non-existence of God. In fact, when I debated Peter Singer, this was the main subject of our debate. And by the way, you could watch that debate if you want to on ABC television in Australia, the Singer-Lennox debate. You can see it, which was on this issue. Now, I take this question enormously seriously, because both I and my atheist friends, we all suffer. I've been to Auschwitz many times, ladies and gentlemen. I've wept many times, every time I've been there. And the hardest question we face as human beings is this. Now, many of my close friends say, look, John, It's okay you arguing like you've done tonight for the existence of God. But please don't talk to me about a personal God. That insults me in the memory of my relatives who were gassed or something like this. And my heart goes out to them. I have no simplistic answer to that. I wouldn't dream of insulting any of you in this audience tonight who are agonizing over possibly the loss of a child or a loved one, or coping with massive amounts of suffering that you conceive to be totally disproportionate and unfair. It's the hardest question we face. So all I can tell you is how I begin to face it. Shall I do that just for a moment or two? As concisely as I can, because I don't want to trivialize this at all. There are two levels. There's an intellectual side to it and there's a pastoral side. Cancer looks very different through the eyes of an oncologist and through the eyes of the young wife who's just been told that she's got 6 months to live. So there are two sides to the question. Whether you're watching it from above as an observer, or whether you as a traveller through life are experiencing it. So we've got to face both of those. Now, many of my friends say there can be no God. So that's their solution to the problem. That is, the universe now is simply a brute fact. And suffering, it's arbitrary. Some people, in fact most people, suffer. A few of us live in a privileged part of the world and we see relatively little of suffering. And it's just a brute fact that we have to face. So that's their solution to it. And I say solution in inverted commas because it doesn't take the suffering away. Suffering's still there. Now, they look at me and I say, okay, there's no God, so that's just a brute fact. So what do you have to say to the young mother who's just been told she's cancer? The answer is nothing. So they say, well, what do you say? Well, I say, how can you still believe in God? Well, I said, you've solved the problem. Or you think you have. I haven't solved it, but I'll tell you how I face it. And it's like this. You see, if you take God out of the equation, you remove all hope, by definition. And Richard Dawkins comes into play here, you see, because his view, and he has never retracted it, I've asked him about it on several occasions, is that this universe is just as you'd expect it to be. If at bottom there's no good, no evil, no justice. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. Now, there's a philosophical side to that. If that is true, of course, that's the end of morality. So talking about the problem of suffering and evil is absurd, because there's no such thing as evil or good. And he hasn't solved that problem either. But leaving that aside, that bleakness, and he said to me, it's bleak. Well, I said his bleakness doesn't guarantee it's true, nor does it guarantee it's false. So is there any evidence anywhere else? And this is how I approach that question. And I want to bring in another question, which is why it's helpful to connect the questions, you see. You were saying that Ravi Zacharias, C.S. Lewis, brings in the question of free will and so on, and that being an explanation for the way in which things go wrong. Now, I do believe that the free will defense has a great deal going for it. But let me just leave that in abeyance as we come to this central problem. You see, when we look at it theoretically, we can argue a good God should have, would have, might have, could have, ought to have, and we've been arguing like that for centuries. Do you know anybody who solved it that way? I know people who put together good philosophical arguments saying that the only way you can have a universe with love in it is to have a universe with choice in it. If you're going to have the choice to say yes, you must have the choice to say no. And I suppose God, in that sense, is faced with the same problem that I was faced with when I brought 3 children into the world. I remember thinking it, you know. I'm bringing children into the world who could grow up to say no to me. Why do we do it? we rather have robotic children? Could God have created a universe with no sin? Of course, very easily. By creating non-moral beings like machines. But you know, when I got home to England next Friday, I wouldn't really like to be greeted by a robotic wife with a series of buttons or a screen that says kiss, and I press and get a robotic kiss. And we laugh at that because we see that there'd be no reality in the relationship. But surely there is weight to the argument that if you're going to create beings that can say yes, they've got to be able to say no. Now, granted that that is so, we come back to my original question. What happens if it goes wrong? I cannot solve the philosophical problem. I know of no one who's solved it satisfactorily. Although I'm prepared to go along with arguments like the ones I've just made. But there's another way of approaching it. And it's this. Is there enough evidence to trust God with the raw edges of it? We can argue about the lower slopes of it, so to speak, and see something. I got to New Zealand 2 days after the earthquake. I had to meet all the pastors in Christchurch less than a week after it happened. I had to meet women who lost their husbands, husbands who lost their wives. I had to speak on radio, television, everywhere else about earthquakes. If you're really interested in this, just Google my name and New Zealand, and there's a whole web page devoted to a detailed explanation of how I responded to the earthquake. But the bottom line is this. Is there evidence to trust God with the rawness of life? You see, about 3 years ago, I nearly died. I was within a few seconds of death. And the doctors did an intervention, put in a stent, saved my life. And people say, isn't that wonderful? God, isn't God wonderful? He saved your life. I say, yes, he is, but let me tell you something else. At the same time, my sister lost her 22-year daughter with a huge brain tumor. If I say thank you to God for saving my life, what do I say to my sister? You see? And if I've nothing to say to her, I better shut up about myself, haven't I? So how do I face the question? Well, ladies and gentlemen, is there evidence? And I think there is. And it helps me answer the final question as well. You say, I talked about evidence-based faith, and you say apart from the evidence of the Bible and the evidence of experience. By the way, not so quick. Apart from, these two evidences are vastly important, and personal experience is the most important of all, of course. What is the evidence? Well, the main evidence to me on this subject is this. That Jesus died on a cross. Now that's very specifically Christian, isn't it? And he made the claim that he was God. So what's God doing on the cross? Well, if that's really true, it means that God has not remained distant from the problem of human suffering, but has himself become part of it. That's point number one. So that enables me to see a window into a solution. Not a simplistic solution, but now comes the next bit. Jesus rose from the dead. I believe that with all my heart as a scientist. David Hume was wrong when he said miracles are violations of the laws of nature. They are not. God, who set the laws in the universe, who set the regularities, isn't a prisoner of them. And he can feed a new event in if he wants to. It doesn't break the laws any more than if I put $100 in my hotel room tonight in the drawer, and $100 tomorrow night, that's $200. And on the third day I find $50. Do I say the laws of arithmetic have been broken, or the laws of Virginia have been broken? Do you see? It's the fact that I know the laws of arithmetic that tells me somebody's put their hand into the drawer. On the higher level, it's exactly the same. If you want to be able to recognize a miracle, you have to know the corresponding law. And we know that dead people normally remain dead. Resurrections are highly improbable. But science cannot prove they're impossible. And if there is a God, he can, by his power, do something. I'm not claiming that Jesus rose from the dead by some natural process going on within the grave. Naturalistic processes, of course not. What I've done for God in great detail. But the point I'm coming to is this. Jesus died and he rose again. That means, ladies and gentlemen, that death is not the end. The significance of that is immense. Richard Dawkins once said, why would anybody be interested in the resurrection? If it is true that someone rose from the dead, this is the biggest thing that's ever happened in history, because it now means that hope is not at an end. And I believe, ladies and gentlemen, that God loves people more than I do. And ultimately, if you could see what's happened to the children and the people that have suffered innocently in this world, I can't prove it to you, ladies and gentlemen. But if you could see into that other world that I believe is even more real than this one, and see what God has done in his fairness, I suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, that you would have no more questions. Thank you very much.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.